So first, let me start by saying something about me,
Yeah, fine.
because I'm a firm believer that all theology at some level is autobiography. That in people who are writing very systematic, very analytical and philosophical theology, at one level, at some level, what they're doing is also talking about themselves, even if it's only indirectly, around the things that interest them. So, so in my sense, my case, I was born in Bradford, West Yorkshire. So although I've lived in for 36 years now in Birmingham, this is a Yorkshire accent. I haven't lost it. Um, but I was born to a family of Caribbean migrants. So I'm part of the Windrush generation. So my parents came from the island of Jamaica to Britain, 1957 and 1959 respectively. They didn't know each other in Jamaica. They met in Bradford through a shared house. Got married, and their eldest child of 4, so born in October 1964. And I guess at one level, I think some people say, and I would probably agree, that black theologians are, that what emerges for us is it's not necessarily a conscious choice, that somehow God, the divine, however you describe God, chooses us. Rather, we choose in black theology. And I think there's an element of truth in that, because I think I have spent most of my life wrestling with two things. One has been the issue of faith. I grew up in a very, very religious household. My mum was a very staunch Christian. My dad slightly less so in those days. He's more of a church person now, but certainly when we were growing up, it was a very Christian home, and we went to church and we were very active in the church. And I, from a very early age, instinctively believed in God, and believed in the God that my mother said I should believe in terms of my upbringing in the church. But alongside that was the reality of discrimination in the society, racism in the society, and also racism within the church. And very early on, my issue was, well, how do you reconcile these two? If God is all powerful, then why does God allow this to happen? And if Christians are meant to love each other, then why is it that we're so bad at doing it, particularly around the issues of race and class? So in some regards, I was thinking theologically long before I knew what theology was. And so there's a story I tell in some of my books when about age 11, 12, I was in a Sunday school class in this particular church I grew up in. We met as the seniors, or it might have been the intermediates, but anyway, in one of the groups, like, we were streamed in different age groups, and we were meeting in a parlour that was at the back of this massive Central Methodist mission. And there was a picture of Jesus on the wall, who was very blonde and very blue-eyed, looked more like Bjorn Borg than Bjorn Borg looks like Bjorn Borg. And I just remember asking my Sunday school teacher and said, Miss, if that is Jesus and the Son of God, and we're all created in the image and likeness of God, then who am I? And she couldn't answer the question. She said, well, it doesn't matter. Now, at one level, I thought, okay, fair enough, it doesn't matter, and I can understand that. I felt loved in the church. It wasn't that somehow I felt I was less than or a second-class citizen. The people were very loving. I mean, it's still racist, mind you, but they were loving and kind, and I enjoyed going to church. So, so when I hear peers talking about they got to teenage years and they didn't want to go to church anymore, the rebellion, that was never me. I loved going to church. My friends were in church, and church was very much part of my social life. So I was growing up in 1970s Bradford with a very religious mother. We're not going to go out to clubs and whatever, but we could go to church and youth clubs and things. So at one level, said it didn't matter, and living in a household where I believed clearly that God loved me and God was impartial insofar as God loved everybody and cared about everybody. That seemed like a reasonable answer. At another level, it was a wholly inadequate answer, because it's a church that was run by white people for white people. Although we were in the church, I remember very clearly that it took them 30 odd years to offer either of them any opportunity to be in leadership, whereas white people seemed to could join the church, and within 2 or 3 years they were offered opportunities to be in leadership. So all the leadership was white. All the images, like this Jesus, were white. Our interpretation of the gospel was very Eurocentric and European, so we very much talked about mission and saving these people in other parts of the world without ever once thinking that actually these other parts of the world that you're talking about represent like the Reddie family. But then again, we were the only black family in the church. So another level, it was wholly inadequate because it did not take account of the social relationships in the church and the power structures and the images and the way in which the faith had been and was being interpreted. That was a very Eurocentric lens. There was nothing positive about Africa. If Africa was ever mentioned, it was full of jungles and people were backward and Christianity had saved them. So by the time I went to university and then got involved in the student Christian movement at the Methodist Society and began to feel a sense of a call to ministry, but not ordained ministry. There were all these images in my head around how I could reconcile my concerns about the social issues and particularly the levels of disadvantage and poverty that existed in Bradford when I was growing up. That we lived in one of the poorest parts of the city, and that's where most of the ethnic minorities lived, in the poorest part of the city. And there was nothing in my church upbringing that spoke about social justice at all. So I remember growing up in the height of Thatcherism, and most people in the church, relatively conservative church, politically and theologically, thought Margaret Thatcher was wonderful. And there was very little dissent about that, even though I knew the impact of my father and people like and other working class people in the region of this particular part of Bradford would be impacted by Thatcherism. The church and the faith had nothing to say about it. So at university I discovered theology, even though I was doing church history. I discovered obviously the theology in church history. And also I think being involved in the student Christian movement, I began to become more politicized and realize that that one could be on the side of social justice and be a Christian. Not all Christians were conservatives as the church I'd grown up in. So I began to discover people who had been resistant to fighting for injustice, began to hear about South Africa and the work of the South African Council of Churches and Desmond Tutu and black theologians in South Africa, but didn't know that any of that existed in the UK, because it did exist in the UK in the 80s. So then realised that it was when I left university and was working as a community worker, largely because I couldn't think of anything else to do, and you didn't need to be trained to be a community worker in those days. So I went on a couple of courses at West Hill, and they unleashed me with my naivety and enthusiasm to work alongside poor, marginalised communities in Birmingham from within the orbit of the Methodist Church as a youth and community worker. And I did that job for 3 years, but I think it was those 3 years that really began to change me, when as I could see the social problems that were affecting presumably African Caribbean young people in that part of Birmingham, in Handsworth. I became aware of my interest in issues of faith and theology and what do they have to say to the realities of school exclusion, of low attainment. There were still are two grammar schools in Handsworth, and hardly anyone from the area in Handsworth goes to those grammar schools. So it's mainly children from very, very affluent parts of other parts of Birmingham get bussed in, but hardly anyone who is in Handsworth and Lascelles actually goes to either the boys' grammar school or the girls' grammar school that are both in that part of Birmingham. I think they're sort of King Edward schools. So all these things began to shape my commitment to thinking about what black liberational theology might look like if one tried to earth it within the British context. And I was fortunate in that at the time the Methodist Church had probably more resources than it has now. And although I said I wasn't necessarily called to ordain ministry, I did feel called to ministry and called to trying to work for the church in these disadvantaged communities, and was able through a number of very, very influential people to be encouraged to undertake postgraduate studies. And so I did. But I chose sort of Christian education and practical theology as a means to do that, rather than the more traditional route for black theology, which is more systematic theology and ethics. And that really was just a very pragmatic thing, really. So 3 reasons, I think. Firstly, I couldn't afford to study full time, so I needed a day job. B, the day job was working for these churches with black children and young people. And then 3, I discovered that if I used the methodology of action research and ethnography, I could actually use the job I was doing as the basis of a form of reflective practice on which I could do my doctorate. So I could still work full time, but still study part time, and use the job I was already being paid to do as the basis on which to base my research. And I did it in the School of Education rather than what was then called the School of Historical Studies, which is where the theology department is. And I did it at the School of Education because I was very much interested in how you create a curriculum that teaches the Christian faith to African Caribbean children and young people. But it's not necessarily primarily about getting them to believe various tenets of the faith or doctrines. It's about how does the faith speak to your life in order to empower you that you can deal with the social issues and conditions in which you find yourself, that it can give you a sense of empowerment and a sense of identity and a sense of self-belief that whatever the world throws at you, your faith enables you to respond, and to respond constructively and positively in order to have some sense of agency. And therefore, so therefore for me, it wasn't necessarily about trying to create a systematic black British theology. It was about saying, well, actually, what's a practical model of black liberation theology in the British context that can be used by churches in order to work directly with children and young people. So that then brought me to John Hull, who at the time was a professor of religious education at Birmingham, but his expertise wasn't just within schools RE, it was also within church education, and very much interested in formation. So what does it mean to form people into the Christian faith? What does it mean to help them to learn and develop and grow in the faith? And what's the relationship between the construction of the faith that you want them to learn and the social context in which that learning takes place? So John Hull was an expert in all of that, and so he was just the person I needed. It just meant that in the end I got a doctoral certificate that says education on it and not theology, which kind of bothered me in the early years. Seems utterly irrelevant now. But at the time I was rather concerned that I'm one of those odd people who has no qualification literally in theology. So my first degree is in history and my PhD is in education. So in some guys, they probably think, it's not the real thing. I said it used to bother me, now I take it as a badge of honor. It's like, yeah, that sums me up. I am not a traditional theologian. But actually, as I said, I think I take that as a badge of honor because I think it's not been traditional that has allowed me to do the work I've done, because I think real life and the realities and the struggles that people face are ones that need something more than just some type of theoretical analysis. And that really has been very much the work I've done ever since, really. Yeah. I guess a fundamental question that has arisen for black theology has always been this question of identity, about who we are as people of African descent and who is God for us amidst the prism of our suffering and our struggles within predominantly white societies, certainly those of us who are in the African diaspora. Slightly different if you're on the continent, but in the diaspora. And for me, I guess within the British context, where most of us are from migrant families, so my family come from Jamaica. I'm the first generation born and brought up in Britain. So who is God and where is God? And what does God have to say to me and to people like myself in our communities? And I guess one of the most instructive experiences for me happened probably actually not, maybe about 10, 15 years ago, when I was beginning to get more settled within the theological academy, within the community of scholars. So people would have known who I was, but perhaps maybe not as well known as I am now, if I'm well known at all. I mean, that's another question. I remember I was given a talk in London, well, actually in Brixton in particular, And I was invited to go to a group of churches, predominantly Pentecostal churches, but not just, it was ecumenical, but a lot of Pentecostals were there. And I was asked to talk about black theology and talk about its significance and why I felt that more churches should be engaging with it, particularly black churches should be engaging with black theology. And so I gave the talk, which on the whole was well received, although there was some level of dissent to it. And at the end of it, there was a young man who got up really quite distressed because he did not agree with anything I had said. And said, he said, being black is irrelevant to me. He says, God is colorblind. And furthermore, he said, I stopped being black when I was saved, which utterly floored me completely. And then I said, which in hindsight was probably not the best answer, I have to say. Well, certainly not a very pastoral one. I looked at him and I said, I really find your answer very, very bizarre and troubling. Because it strikes me that if you stopped being black when you were saved, then why was blackness so bad that God had to save you from it? At which he then came back and said, but God is colorblind, at which a significant section of the audience who had been in dissent to what I was saying all clapped and agreed. Which then led me to write what probably still my most well-known book, only because it's not that thick, so it's relatively easy to read, and it's not that expensive, so it's relatively easy to buy. And the book is called Is God Colorblind? That I did in 2010 with SPCK. And the book really was my attempt to wrestle with the question that this young man had posed to me. That is God colorblind was a major challenge. Does God see color? Does God see the ethnic and cultural and differences that seem to have bedeviled us for millennia within the human family? But also not just about whether God sees difference, is God colorblind, but the more specific question is around the nature of blackness, or people who are identified as, or racially identified as being black. That what is it about that condition that makes some people want to run away from it, or want to believe that their faith transcends it. So I kind of wrestle with that, and I guess it's something that black scholars still wrestle with. And we wrestle with it for a number of reasons. One is, and I've often said this in classes I teach, that one of the advantages of being white is that one doesn't have to think about it. I have some white friends who are wrestled with being white, but they're in the minority because they're interested in looking at constructs and what does it mean and how does power work and visual images work and representation. But they're in the main, for the most part, most white people don't get up and have a deep sigh and think, ooh, now what does it mean to be white? Because they don't. Yet I think every black person at some point has to wrestle with what it means to be black, even if it means not to think about it. That is a deliberate choice some people make. So I have people in my family who will say, Anthony, I don't want to talk about being black. I don't want to talk about being, I don't want to talk about race. I just want to be a human being. I don't want to talk about it at all. But that's a choice they have made in order to deal with this conundrum. And some of it, I think, also comes down to that sense of what does it mean to be perceived as a problem? What does it mean to be in a black body that has been so problematized over generations, succeeding generations, over certainly 600, 700 years actually within the body politic of the West, that sometimes just turning up and being who you are before you even say anything is perceived as a problem or a mark of curiosity. And certainly I remember when I was younger, just wanting to be invisible. I just wanted to be like everybody else. And so curiously enough, when well-meaning liberals would try to say, Anthony, we recognize you and we want to do something to help you. Even though I knew that they were trying to help me in a converse way, I resented it because I didn't want to be recognized as different. I just want to be like everybody else. Obviously, it's very different now when I'm a black theologian, so I talk about these things all the time, and I want people not to recognize me. But I understand where the young man was coming from, and that's why I mean, if I could find him, I've never seen him since, I would apologize for my response, because although I was still troubled by his rationale, he has the right to determine how he wants to see himself. So therefore, if he wants to believe that he has transcended being black through his faith, I can see that. I don't agree with it, but I can see it because I think if the associations with blackness and being black are wholly negative, I can see why you would want to transcend it. If our only way of identifying difference is as a problem, as a form of deviance, as a form of pathology, I can see why someone would say, actually, I just want to be invisible. I just want to be a human being. I don't want to talk about being black. I don't want to have to filter everything through that particular lens. I don't want people to think that because I'm black, I'm therefore have to talk about race. I just want to talk, some of us just want to talk about anything in the way in which white people can talk about anything. So I can understand that. I think the problem with that is twofold. One is by trying to avoid it, it then reinforces the notion that it is a problem. If it's not a problem, then you don't want to avoid it. Because it's a problem, you want to avoid it. And therefore, whilst I understand people wanting to avoid it, that doesn't get at the nature of the problem itself. And the problem, I've often said, and I say in the book, difference isn't the problem. It is the symbolic power that we attach to some notions of difference. It's the way in which we make value judgments on some versions of difference. That's the issue. It's the interpretation of difference, not the difference itself. So that's one issue, I think, with the problem of trying to transcend it. The other difference is, of course, it just doesn't affirm the value of that experience in the first place. The reason why I want people to notice that I'm black, but notice it in a positive way, is because there is so much about being black and black culture that I love. I love the fact that my parents are Caribbean. I love the fact that there is a whole set of culture, both linguistic, musical, culinary, stylistic, all those things. I just love. I can't imagine not being who I am because that shaped me in powerful ways. And therefore, when you don't see it, what you're not seeing is all the richness that my culture and traditions have brought to humanity in general and brought to British life in particular. Therefore, by trying to transcend it, what we're doing is running away from what I believe is a God-given gift. For me in particular, and for those of us who identify as black, I believe that God has created us this way. And our role is to celebrate it and to encourage other people to appreciate it. So therefore, for me, black liberation theology has two modes. One is affirmation, that sense of the affirmation of blackness. However one understands that, largely linked to being of African descent, African culture, African history, traditions, our dresses, our styles, our speech patterns, our ways of seeing the world. All that totality is stuff that I want to affirm. And I'm a huge consumer of black expressive culture. And actually that's been one of the most powerful forms of exploitation of blackness, although sometimes it can lead to that being being commodified. I know that, but that sense of what we have given to the world, if one takes music, without black culture, there is no popular music. Full stop. So I want to affirm that. But on the other hand, I think black theology also has a social critical perspective, which is the critique of whiteness. Now, and I say in the book, it's called Colorblind. By that I mean I'm not critiquing white people. I'm critiquing a set of constructs that lead white people to believe themselves to be superior. That's what I'm critiquing. So I'm not critiquing difference. I'm not critiquing white people for being white any more than I want people to critique me for being black. That's what we're born into. But how we live that out and how that impacts on people's life experiences and choices and opportunities, those are the things I want to critique. And so black theology has those two things. It's the affirmation of blackness and a critique of the spurious alleged superiority of whiteness as those two, as constructs. Understand that no one is literally black and no one is literally white. So these are our symbolic ways of understanding the world. And so Is God Colorblind, I think, in many respects is a kind of symbolic totem for everything else I've tried to do. This sense of, well, actually, it's also a philosophical question. Is God colorblind? And what I say in the book is, well, ultimately, we don't know actually what God sees and what God doesn't see. That one of my favourite quotes comes from my all-time hero, which is James H. Cone. James Cone is essentially the inventor of black liberation theology as an academic discipline. Black people have been doing theology as a liberative project for as long as we've been suffering from the epoch of slavery onwards. But in terms of writing it down as a cohesive system of thought, that's James Cone. So the first black theology book is Black Theology and Black Power, published in 1969. And Cone, who died in 2018, remains the preeminent black theologian. And Cone says, theology is human speech about God. God does not do theology, because God knows God's self. Theology is what human beings do, faith, seeking understanding. And as an addendum, he then says, always beware of the people who believe they're writing theology with God sat on their shoulder, kind of dictating it to them. He says, they're the scary people who then later end up doing some really awful, horrific event, and then say, oh yeah, but like God told me to do it. He says, there's always a gap between what we write about God and who God is in God's self, because we're not God. So therefore, I say all that to say, is God colorblind? Well, I really don't know, ultimately. However, on the basis of the biblical witness and on the basis of understanding our humanity, I think God is not colorblind. I think God sees color. What God doesn't do is to see the value judgments that we make around it that puts it into hierarchy with whiteness at the top and blackness at the bottom and various variations in between, as if somehow there is a moral and an ontological value between one set of human beings and another set of human beings. Scripture tells us that we're all created in the image and likeness of God. But the incarnation tells us that God is also particular in terms of Jesus was born in a particular time and space and was a particular human being. And all of us are particular human beings. And Pentecost shows us the affirmation of difference in terms of unity is not predicated upon uniformity. So I believe that God is not colorblind. I don't believe that God is schizophrenic to have created difference and then spent the whole of God's time then ignoring the difference that God created. I mean, that doesn't make any sense. And as I think that God is perfect and true, then I believe that God is not schizophrenic in God's own self. So I have no reason to believe that God does not see color. But I have to say that that's my assertion. That's not God speaking. That's my belief based upon thought and reflection and various articulations. But I think that's important because I think in our present age, my current book, which maybe I'll talk about in a moment in terms of theologizing Brexit, is this question about how we live together and how we affirm difference and how we wrestle with the temptation of scapegoating, particularly those people who are not part of the mainstream or part of the majority, and the temptation of human beings always to try to find someone or some groups to blame for social ills that are much deeper and more systemic than we want to give credit for.